احذروا الدول الصغرى أو كيف تحول لبنان إلى ساحة لصراعات الشرق الأوسط. كتاب أكاديمي بدقته ومراجعه الواسعة، ولكن أيضا كتاب صحافي بأسلوبه وبشغفه. كاتبه ديفيد هيرست، الكاتب والصحافي البريطاني اللي اتخذ من بيروت موطنه، واللي عايش حروب وصراعات الشرق الأوسط على مدى 5 عقود من خلال عمله بصحيفة الجارديان. ديفيد هيرست الصحافي اللي خطف مرتين في لبنان في الثمانينيات، واللي بتتهمه إسرائيل بالانحياز التام للعرب بوقت هو ضيف غير مرغوب أو مرحب فيه بأكثر من دولة عربية. ديفيد هيرست هو ضيفنا بترانزيت لليلة. مساء الخير ديفيد.
Good evening.
ديفيد، احذروا الدول الصغرى فهي دائما ضحية الدول الأكبر منها، لكنها أيضا مصدر أخطار عليها. هذا ما قاله ميخائيل باكونين، ويبدو أن نظرتك للبنان مماثلة لما قاله باكونين. دون شك أن لبنان هو ساحة للصراعات لدول الشرق الأوسط، ولكن اللي مش واضح يمكن بالكتاب كيف لبنان ممكن أن يكون مصدر أخطار على المحيط.
Let me tell you about the title first. I thought this was the perfect title for my book. I was not going to write the book unless I found this title. I knew there was a quotation of this kind relating to 19th century Europe, but I could not find it. I only found it by accident on the internet after almost giving up the project until I found it. It fits Lebanon perfectly. What Mikhail Bakunin was saying about the 19th century Europe was that small states, like, for example, Belgium or Latvia on the Baltic Sea, were victims of the ambitions and designs of larger states, like the Russian Empire, like Germany under Bismarck. But they were also a source of trouble. They created trouble simply because they were an area of competition between the greater states. Now, I feel that Lebanon falls into this pattern even more dramatically than those states I mentioned in the 19th century Europe. Lebanon is, it seems to me, permanently plays this role of small state in the region. But in addition to being small, it is also what we call a sectarian state, and this gives greater opportunity for outside powers to intervene in its internal affairs. But they cause trouble to themselves. This competition causes trouble to themselves. The very fact that Lebanon is an arena of conflict like this means that these greater states come into collision with each other on Lebanese territory. Further,
نعم ديفيد، يعني بدي أحكي بالتفصيل بالموضوع الكتاب وبعدد من العناوين الأساسية اللي طرحتها، ولكن هل الكتاب هو عن لبنان؟ هل هو عن إسرائيل؟ أم هو عن إيران وحزب الله؟ أم هو أولا وأخيرا كتاب عن فلسطين؟
The book evolved as I wrote it. In the end, we can say that it's about the whole Lebanon and the whole region, all those states and entities which you mentioned. But in point of fact, I knew it before, but I discovered it more and more as I was writing it. The main theme of a Middle Eastern conflict, namely the Arab-Israeli one, plays itself out on Lebanese territory more consistently, more continuously, in various different forms, than you can say of almost any other state or people in the region, except, of course, the Palestinians themselves.
طيب ديفيد، الكتاب يعني بدي جرب أعالج بعض العناوين اللي أنت شرحتها فيه. في 4 محطات بدي أتناولها. الأولى هي لبنان في النظرة أو في المشروع الصهيوني قبل دولة إسرائيل. يعني هون بدي أعترف لك بأنه عدد كبير من اللي قروا الكتاب، عدد كبير من الأشخاص هيك تحدثوا عن فكرة دليل سياحي بالعبري عن لبنان، انه كانت مفاجأة بالنسبة لهم، وبتنطوي على بتضوي على يعني بداية العلاقات بين لبنان والمهاجرين اليهود. النقطة الثانية اللي بدي أحكي فيها هي كيف عالجت بكتابك الثورة الإسلامية بإيران الصعود الشيعي في لبنان اللي كان موازي لهذه الثورة. النقطة الثالثة اللي هي أيضا مرتبطة بالنقطة الثانية واللي خصصت جزء كبير من الكتاب للحديث عنها، وهي حزب الله أو قراءتك لحزب الله بالتنقل بين العمل الجهادي والعمل المسلح وما أسميته البراغماتية أو التدريجية. النقطة الرابعة هي الحرب السابعة واللي يعني للأسف عم بتبشرنا فيها أنها قادمة. ديفيد، بدي بلش بالنقطة الأولى. يعني بتفتح الكتاب على مرحلة بتعتبرها أنها مركزية بالنسبة لمآسي الشرق الأوسط، واللي هي مرحلة الاستيطان اليهودي في فلسطين. يعني بس يمكن في إضافة بكتابك أنه هي كيف نظر اليهود إلى لبنان قبل قيام دولة لبنان وقبل قيام دولة إسرائيل. يعني اشرح لي كيف وصلنا لنطبع ببيروت الدليل السياحي بالعبري، كيف انتقلنا من مرحلة تبادل تجاري واستثمارات متبادلة إلى مرحلة العداء.
Yes, a lot of people who've read the book have highlighted this thing. It seems unimaginable now, I know, that the Lebanese should have been hosting Jewish Palestinian guests in their hotels and even going to the point of bringing in Hebrew newspapers from Palestine and having kosher chefs in their hotels. That is indeed what happened. The Israelis, or the Zionists as they were at that time, were looking for allies wherever they could find them from the very origins of their enterprise in Palestine. In those days, of course, they were not a state, they were weak, they were dependent on the British to help them to create what eventually became a state. They felt that in what they called Christian Lebanon of the time, they had a natural ally. And they felt that those Christians, principally Maronites, some of them at least, shared this belief that the Zionists would be a natural ally for them too. This was because they had, I suppose, basically a minority complex. They felt that this could strengthen them against what they felt to be an unsympathetic, even a hostile environment. And so contacts developed between them, and they developed quite extensively. However, there were differences of opinion, of course, within the Maronite community. There were those, what I call in my book, the pro-Zionists, who were ready to go the whole way in some such future relationship. There were others whom I call the Arabists, who recognized that though a minority, their destiny lay with their natural environment, which was there in Lebanon, their Muslim compatriots, and in the Arab world as a whole, they're predominantly Muslim fellow Arabs as well. So there was a constant sort of conflict within the Maronite community over this whole issue from the very first contacts, which took place essentially before the First World War, but developed quite strongly in the 20s, until the formation of the state.
ديفيد، يعني بدي أقرأ فقرة صغيرة من الكتاب واللي أنت أيضا أخذتها عن أحد المؤسسين الأساسيين لحزب الليكود، واللي يمكن بتصلح اليوم أنه تكون كأن كلام بيصدر عن بنيامين نتنياهو رئيس الوزراء الإسرائيلي. بتقول نقلا عن جابوتينسكي: كل شعب أصلي سوف يقاوم الاستيطان الأجنبي طالما رأوا أن هناك أمل من التخلص من خطر الاستيطان، فهكذا سوف يتصرف الفلسطينيون طالما احتفظوا ببصيص أمل بأنهم سوف يمنعون فلسطين من أن تتحول إلى أرض إسرائيل. أي اتفاق بإرادة حرة لن يتحقق، وهكذا فعلينا إما أن نوقف جهودنا الاستيطانية أو نتابع الاستيطان دون أن نعير أي أهمية لإرادة السكان الأصليين. الاستيطان يمكن أن يستمر ويتطور وراء حائط فولاذي لن يكون بإمكانهم أن يهدموه. يعني هذا الكلام اللي صدر بالعام 1923 لفلاديمير تشابوتنسكي واللي هو مؤسس حزب الليكود، يعني هاي الكلمات تصلح اليوم كأنها يقولها بنيامين نتنياهو.
Well, yes, essentially I think they are. I think the Zionists recognized, in fact realistically, that they, after some initial attempts to win some Arab sympathy for the notion of setting up a Jewish national home, as it was called in those days, they realized that their Palestinian and Arab environment would be essentially hostile to what they were trying to do. Recognizing that, they decided that force was really the only way they could achieve their aims. And it began, of course, in a small way, but they were preparing to use force from the very beginning. Herzl's writings were among the most earliest of that kind. And it came to a head in what was the premeditated usurpation of Palestine in 1948. They say that that came about because the Arabs attacked the Zionists at that time. Of course, the Arabs did attack the Zionists. They did seek to prevent the formation of this state. But the real aggression from the very beginning was theirs. Essentially, the Arabs' action was a reaction. And this was premeditated force, which eventually reached the point of massive ethnic cleansing. But the Iron Wall continues to this day. The Israelis rely, in the final analysis, on force. They will not relinquish that option unless they are forced to, and their reliance on it enables them so far to maintain themselves in this region in the way that they do, in spite of the absence of a peaceful settlement and all the world's attempts to achieve a peaceful settlement.
ديفيد، يعني جيفري وودكروفت واللي هو من صحيفة الواشنطن بوست بيقول عنك أنك مؤرخ منحاز، ولكن هذا لا يعني أنك غير صادق. كتابك يعني هو إدانة ليس فقط يعني لإسرائيل اليوم أو بالعام 2006 ولا حتى بالعام 1982. كتابك هو إدانة لفكرة إسرائيل بحد ذاتها. ألا تتحول إلى مراقب منحاز إلى الجانب الفلسطيني؟ يعني
No, I don't think I am, actually. I would like to cite a colleague of mine, namely Robert Fisk, who mentioned me in a complimentary way in a recent article in which he said David Hurst manages to take the Palestinian side or present the Palestinian case or the Arab case without any romanticizing of the Palestinians. So no, I don't consider myself biased, but no.
يعني ما بتخاف إنك تنوضع بهالخانة؟
Well, I don't mind if I'm called biased. I don't mind if I'm called unobjective, provided I believe that what I'm saying is the most well-researched and honest attempt to state
صحيح. كتابك يعني كتير، ونحن قلنا بالمقدمة أنه أكاديمي وعنده مراجع عديدة وكتير دقيق، ولكن ما بتعتبر أنه يعني بتخاف أنه تنوضع بمناهضة، أو حتى يمكن البعض بيقول أنه كتابك هو بحد ذاته إدانة لإسرائيل.
I don't think this gentleman you're talking about said that I said it's a condemnation of Israel. I think you're wrong on that point. I think he's saying that it's possible.
أنا ما عم بعني جيفري، عم بعني إنه البعض بيعتبر كتابك إدانة لإسرائيل.
Well, I suppose you could say that it's certainly, yes, it's a, look, let's put it this way. I don't think in any conflict in the world there is such a thing as total objectivity by an outside observer. But let me put it simply this way. I believe that in this conflict is a rare case in which one side is infinitely more responsible for the conflict than the other. I mean, if I was to put it in quantitative terms, I mean, instinctively I would look in any conflict with which I'm not familiar, I would try to find both sides, judge the relative responsibility. And my starting point would probably be that it's 50-50. In this case, I feel that it's not that it's probably, let's say, 10-15% one side, and 85-90 the other side.
على كل ديفيد، بدنا نتابع الحديث عن كتابك، وبعد الفاصل رح نحكي على الثورة الإسلامية بإيران والزلزال اللي وصلت تردداته إلى لبنان. بعد الفاصل. عودة لمتابعة ترانزيت. ديفيد، بكتابك خصصت مساحة واسعة ودقيقة للحديث عن الثورة الإسلامية بإيران، يعني نظرة آية الله الخميني إلى الصراع مع إسرائيل كوسيلة لتوحيد القوى الإسلامية. حكيت عن التحالف الإيراني السوري اللي ولدوا العداء المشترك لصدام حسين وترجم فعليا في لبنان. يعني السؤال، في كثير من الكتاب والدبلوماسيين راهنوا على الابتعاد ما بين سوريا وإيران، رغم ذلك دام هذا التحالف 30 سنة ولا يزال حتى الآن ربما أقوى من السابق. أين برأيك يختلف المشروع الإيراني عن الأهداف السورية؟
Yes, this alliance is perhaps the most enduring alliance in the Middle East, and you could say it's a rather unnatural, unusual alliance. A, because it's an alliance between an Arab state and a non-Arab state, sometimes seen as being at the expense of other Arab states, and two very different kinds of regimes, Ba'athist secular Syria and Islamist Iran. It has withstood all attempts to break it apart for 30 years, and as you say, it seems to survive and even get stronger. Well, clearly the two sides find a common interest, and on Syria's part, it began essentially, or grew out of the Iraqi-Iranian the hostility between the two Ba'athist regime. When the Islamic Revolution took place, President Assad saw a valuable potential ally in the similarly anti-Iraqi Islamic regime. That was the origin of it. But it's grown into something very different and much more far-reaching than that since. The Syrians, in some sense, they are, the linchpin of the Arab system, as we call it. They consider themselves the heart of Arabism and the main champions of the prime Arab cause, the Palestinian cause. But they are weak in various ways vis-a-vis those whom they're confronting, led by Israel. So naturally they seek strength elsewhere. And they find it in Iran, they find it via their proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and also, we could say by extension, in Hamas. So that is the essential basis of the relationship.
يعني كل المحاولات اللي جرت لتصدير الثورة الإسلامية ونموذجها بمناطق عديدة من العالم فشلت إلا بلبنان. لماذا برأيك؟
Well, you can't say no. I don't call Lebanon an Islamic country.
يعني بذلك مش دولة إسلامية، إنما نموذج حزب الله اللي هو يعتبر حليف أساسي لإيران.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, you could say that in its foreign policy, you could argue that what the Iranians have achieved in Lebanon is their greatest continuing success. I wouldn't disagree with that. But it is, Hezbollah now plays a role on its own, you know, it's a force in its own right.
يعني هل تعني انه حزب الله اليوم يعني انت كتبت بكتابك انه بدأ صعود حزب الله مع بداية الثورة الإسلامية ولا سيما من بعد الاجتياح الإسرائيلي بالعام 82. هل كان في عامل مساعد لنمو حزب الله؟
Well, I say three factors. I say that one was the Islamic Revolution. That was one, so to speak, parent or progenitor of Hezbollah. I say that the other one was Israel, and that is what Nasrallah himself has once said, that Israel created conditions in Lebanon which enabled the rise of a movement like Hezbollah. And I say that in a way Syria was the third party, but a sort of midwife, but the two main creators were Israel and a conjunction of the Islamic Republic and Israel.
متى تحولت فعليا يعني علاقة إيران وإسرائيل إلى عداء برأيك؟ يعني نحن بنعرف أنه بكتابك أيضا ذكرت أنه من 79 لمنتصف الثمانينات كانت ما تزال إسرائيل تعتبر إيران حليف استراتيجي، وحتى إيران لم تتردد في قبول الدعم الإسرائيلي في حربها على العراق.
That's correct. Iran used to be a member of what the Israelis call the Alliance of the Periphery. They had a strategy of trying to develop relationships with states basically surrounding the Arab world, because they saw the Arab world naturally enough as the main, their main threat and their main enemy. And they tried to develop relationships with those who were potentially hostile to the Arabs in their turn, Iran, Ethiopia, Turkey, and so on. But when the Islamic Revolution took place, there was a complete and radical change in the attitude of the new Iran to Israel. It became deeply ideologically hostile. But the Israelis kept trying to preserve the notion of Iran as an ally. When the hostage crisis took place in Lebanon, the Israelis were prime movers in supplying arms to the Iranians, along with the Americans, but they encouraged the Americans to do that. This was not really to help the American hostages. It was to try and regain Iran as a friend. They felt that Iran would never renounce what Israelis considered to be its historic national interest, which would cause it to maintain a friendship with the Arabs' other enemy, the Israelis themselves. And they maintained this until as late as the 1991, 92, 93, so much so that at that time the Israelis were urging the Americans not to take seriously Iran's threats against Israel.
بكتابك بصفحة 185 بتتحدث عن عرض سخي يعني قدمته إيران إلى سوريا بإرسال 40,000 مقاتل زائد 10,000 من الحرس الثوري لصد الاجتياح الإسرائيلي على لبنان. والأهم من العرض رفض سوريا لهذا العرض، واللي اعتبرته برأيك اللحظة اللي كانت مفصلية بتاريخ المنطقة. كيف بمجرد رفضت سوريا العرض الإيراني ممكن هالقد يترك تبعات، واللي حكيت عنه أيضا بكتابك، على الوضع الحالي الذي ما زلنا نعيشه في لبنان؟
Yes, it's true. The Iranians, partly it was a kind of gratitude, I think, on the part of the Iranians for the help which Syria had given them in their war against Iraq. But yes, they did offer to send a large number of troops, but President Assad apparently refused that because I think he felt that it wouldn't make any practical difference in his struggle with Israel, military struggle, confrontation with Israel in Lebanon. It was already too late. The Israelis had already inflicted very heavy damage on his army and on his air force. And they felt that it would invite yet greater Israeli response, which might lead to even the overthrow of his regime.
بعد الفاصل رح نكمل الحديث عن حزب الله، كيف تحول من دولة مصغرة في لبنان إلى حزب سياسي جهادي بعد الفاصل. عودة لمتابعة ترانزيت مع ديفيد هيرست. ديفيد، يعني أنت بتشرح عن طريقة عمل حزب الله بكتابك من خلال وجهتين نظر، الأولى جهادية وكفاح مسلح، الوجهة الثانية أو الأسلوب الثاني تصفه بالبراغماتي والتدريجي. يعني فهمك لحزب الله هو بالتنقل بين هذين الأسلوبين، اشرح لي كيف يعني.
Well, a basic thesis of my book is this, that Hezbollah, it says itself that the prime, at this juncture anyway, the prime activity of jihadism, as they understand it, I mean, of course it's to create an Islamic order everywhere, but in practical terms at the moment, the main active field for this is jihad in the military sense, vis-a-vis Israel. Now, but Hezbollah is, I think, a very intensely ideological movement. You might almost call it messianic movement. But also, its leadership is clearly are politicians and realists and pragmatists. And they know when they have to, they cannot practice jihadism in its pure military form without risking their whole enterprise. I mean, that became particularly clear after the year 2000, when they had achieved this great triumph, being the only Arab party ever to have expelled the Israelis from any Arab territory. It was a great victory, but it posed a dilemma because jihad for Hezbollah, as I said, is, well, liberating Jerusalem. That's their official aim.
ما بتعتقد انه اعاد يعني وجهة نظره تغيرت مع الوثيقة التي قدمها بالعام 2009 وثيقة حزب الله؟
Which one?
وثيقة السياسية التي قدمها حزب الله في العام الماضي وأعاد قراءة كل العمل السياسي والعمل الجهادي فيها. ما بتعتبر أنه في تغيير حصل؟
Yeah. Well, there is a change. I mean, but I was going to illustrate my point by saying that pure jihadism after 2000 would have been far too dangerous because the world accepted the idea that Hezbollah was at that before 2000 was really liberating Lebanese national territory, but anything that it did thereafter, militarily speaking, would be this much greater, higher ambition, the pursuit of jihad. So it changed its strategy. It became pragmatic. It renounced resistance in the full sense of the word and resorted to those tactics which did involve some military action, which continued until the 2006 war. Similarly, it renounced its ambitions, its official ambitions, to Islamicize its environment, namely in Lebanon. I mean, but it did that not just with the document, the recent document you were talking about. It's been evolving for a long time, ever since Hezbollah basically emerged on the scene. I mean, let's say after the 1990s, it began to integrate itself into Lebanese politics, and something which it had rejected in its early, purely ideological phase. So it's a continuing process. But does it mean that it's renounced its higher ideological aims? I don't think so.
ديفيد، أنت من الصحفيين القلائل يعني وخاصة الصحفيين الغربيين اللي بيعتبر أنه حزب الله دائما في حروبه كان المنتصر. في سؤال يعني انطرح بالإعلام الدولي والعربي بعد العدوان الإسرائيلي بال2006 أنه من كان المنتصر؟ أنت دائما تقول أنه حزب الله كان المنتصر في كل الحروب.
Well, it's a kind of cliche among military historians and so on that a guerrilla movement wins if it doesn't lose. I mean, if it's not defeated. It won in terms definitely of the expectations which both sides, Israel and Hezbollah, had when the war began. Israel's ambition was to destroy Hezbollah. And apparently it thought it could do it, but it did not destroy Hezbollah. Far from it. It increased its prestige, and strengthened it. It's still there, and it's rearming, and it's stronger than ever before. So it's there to fight another day. The Israelis did not destroy it, and the very fact that they didn't destroy it means that it was the same with Hamas. They didn't destroy Hamas either. So it retained its territory, it retained its ability to pursue its resistance.
يعني تعني بذلك أنه حزب الله فاز في كل جولاته ضد إسرائيل؟
Well, it didn't defeat Israel. I mean, it didn't. It was an inconclusive war. But I say that in terms of its own expectations and anybody else's serious expectations, yes, it was really a victory.
ليش كل الصحفيين الأجانب لما بدهم يحكوا عن لبنان دايما بدهم يحكوا عن حزب الله، حجم حزب الله، أهداف حزب الله؟ لماذا حزب الله دائما في المقالات، في الكتب، يعني بكل الكتب اللي بنشوفها عن لبنان حزب الله موجود؟ هل هو المعيار أو المقياس؟ هل حجمه ودوره صار أكبر من البلد؟
Well, obviously, look, I've been living in Lebanon for 50 years, and as a journalist, it worked out that basically I never really covered Lebanon as such, unless there was something which interested the outside world. I mean, before 1975, Lebanon got very little coverage in the outside world. So it's the same now. It is Hezbollah, and all its implications, which makes Lebanon interesting to the outside world. It's as simple as that. I mean, I don't think there's a special focus on Hezbollah. Well, there is a special focus on Hezbollah because Hezbollah is this actor which makes Lebanon interesting internationally. I mean, for journalists and diplomats and leaders of governments.
بعد الفاصل الأخير الحرب السابعة آتية كما يقول ديفيد هيرست. عودة لمتابعة الفقرة الأخيرة من ترانزيت. ديفيد، الحرب السابعة اللي ذكرتها بكتابك من أين ستأتي شرارتها؟ هل ستأتي على خلفية إيران أم ستأتي على خلفية المأزق بعملية السلام؟
I think it could come from either of those and more, in fact. I mean, let us take Lebanon first and Hezbollah. I mean, there are good reasons why these two entities, Hezbollah and Israel, could find themselves at war again. I mean, I don't believe that in the long run Israel can live with an organization on its frontiers like Hezbollah. In the same way, for example, that it felt it couldn't live with Yasser Arafat's PLO in Lebanon, even though the PLO in those was much less of a danger to Israel than Hezbollah is today. But Israel feels the need to police its environment, and it feels ultimately that if Hezbollah ultimately constitutes an existential threat, not necessarily in itself, but what it could lead to. And it keeps saying that sooner or later, inevitably, we will have to deal with this organization. So it's inevitable sooner or later. It probably grow out of some miscalculation, maybe, like, for example.
ولكن بالفترة الأخيرة كتير الحكي والتردد يعني بوسائل الإعلام والكلام التصعيدي على موضوع الحرب، ومنه طبعا على خلفية الكلام عن صواريخ أسكاد، طبعا في تصريحات أمريكية، في تصريحات إسرائيلية، في تصريحات عديدة عم تتصاعد للحديث كله عن موضوع الحرب. هل الحرب هذه المرة ستؤدي إلى نتائج سياسية؟
Well, it depends on what kind of war you're talking about. I was just laying out the possible forms which a war could take. Yes, there is this talk of war, and it takes a much wider dimension than simply a bilateral war of the kind which we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, strictly limited to Lebanon and Israel. This time, I feel there is a great potentiality for a Middle Eastern war, like wars used to be before organizations like the PLO and then Hezbollah became the only protagonists on the Arab side. The next war in its ultimate dimensions could very well incorporate Hezbollah and Syria and Iran and Hamas and all those members of the so-called Islamo-nationalist resistance camp, or whatever you want to call it. And it could grow out of the nuclear confrontation, for example. Or it could start with that, and the Iranian allies in the region could get involved as a result, or it could be the other way around. It could grow out of a Hezbollah-Lebanese confrontation. It's clear to me that the Syrians and the Iranians are more strongly intimating to the Israelis that they would get involved if Israel attacked Hezbollah alone. And Israel itself is saying similar things vis-a-vis Syria. It said it's going to bomb Syria back into the Stone Age last week if Hezbollah attacks Israel.
يعني هنا عم نحكي نحن عن مواجهة خارجية فقط وليس مواجهة بالداخل اللبناني.
You mean a domestic? I'm talking about a war between Israel and you're talking about.
نعم، هون عم بدي أكد أنه ما تقوله هو مواجهة خارجية مع إسرائيل وليس أنه خلق مواجهة داخلية لحزب الله بالداخل اللبناني.
That's internal domestic politics. I see. Well, I do see certain possible scenarios, obviously, where a war between Hezbollah and Israel alone could produce internal repercussions in Lebanon. Because of, especially, of course, if Hezbollah were seen to start this war, but I do not believe that Hezbollah is going to do that, because it knows that that would deeply antagonize large sections of this society.
بدي أرجع لكتابك واللي ختمت فيه يعني الحديث عن سلام أوباما أو الحرب السابعة. هل تراهن على أوباما بوقف الحرب؟
Well, I say that if there is no, it's always been the case in the Middle East. Whenever there is no peace, or wherever there is no peace or no progress or visible progress towards peace, sooner or later, violence takes over. And I feel that we're approaching one of those points, but with new actors this time. As I said in my book, for the last 37 years, the only area of military the only border of military confrontation between Israel and the Arabs has taken place in Lebanon. I don't include Palestinian-Israeli conflict in this. And what I'm saying is that this time it may be a Middle Eastern war. And this will grow out of the failure for the parties, the two sides, to achieve any peace or prospect of peace. That is why, Obama clearly thinks that too, and because he's saying he's saying to the Israelis, and I do believe that this is a serious showdown between the Israelis and the Americans. It's becoming more and more clear. If you don't help us to make peace by making your contribution to peace, then you will face a war, and you will face, and Hillary Clinton more or less said it, you will face a new kind of war, of a kind which you haven't faced before, against which you don't have real protection, and i.e. a missile war. She said that. She and others have said that kind of thing to the Israelis.
ديفيد، الحرب السابعة هل هي الحرب السابعة العربية أم هي الحرب الثانية لإسرائيل على إيران؟
The second war against Iran.
بعد 2006 عم بعني.
Well, if it's a Middle Eastern war, it's clearly going to incorporate an Iranian and an Arab element. I mean, it's going to be, by definition, Iranian and Arab. I mean, if Syria gets involved.
هل عم تقول هالشيء من بعد ما شفنا المشهد بدمشق اللي جمع الرئيس الإيراني محمود أحمدي نژاد والرئيس السوري بشار الأسد والأمين العام لحزب الله السيد حسن نصر الله؟
Well, I'm saying that that meeting and all that it implied, because it carried a kind of implication in a way that it wasn't formal, but you had a feeling that it was as if they might have been writing a mutual defense pact or something between all these parties. And that's why I'm saying that the next war is likely to be a global Middle Eastern war. And that was one of the episodes in the build-up to such a war, in my analysis. The Israeli, look, it works both ways. You could argue that the Syrians and the Iranians, by identifying themselves so closely with Hezbollah in such a meeting, we're saying to the Israelis, look, if you attack Hezbollah, you're attacking us too. And the Israelis, so it's trying to tell the Israelis, don't do it, because, you know, it's going to be very bad for you to take on all these enemies. A kind of deterrent strategy on their part. Similarly, the Israelis are saying, if Hezbollah attacks, we'll attack Syria too. In other words, they're saying, Syria, this time, don't take this risk. You're playing with fire. Well, you are going to get attacked too. You've stayed out of Lebanese wars so far, but this time you're going to be burned as well.
سؤال أخير ديفيد، شعورك هل فعلا رح يكون في حرب هذا العام؟
No, I don't think so. I don't.
ديفيد هيرست الصحفي البريطاني، شكرا لوجودك معنا ببرنامج ترانزيت. وبدي أذكر أنه الكتاب اللي صدر من نيويورك تحت عنوان احذروا الدول الصغرى هو موجود بكافة المكتبات وهو صادر باللغة الإنجليزية. ديفيد شكرا لك، شكرا لوجودك بترانزيت. مشاهدينا بالختام تذكروا لما تطفوا الشاشة الأحداث ما بتوقف. ترانزيت الأسبوع المقبل نفس الشاشة نفس الوقت.